thank you everyone for joining us. We have an awesome panel of local experts here today, one of which is in Salt Lake City right now, so more of a regional expert, I guess. If you guys could all just take a moment to introduce yourselves, starting with Carl, and let us know your favorite regional bird as well, if you could pick one.
Okay, my name is Carl Brown. Currently work for Biodiversity Research Institute on common loons and harlequin, but more recently also on alpine songbirds, including, I think I'm required to say my favorite regional bird is the black rosy finch. So
we'll hear from Erica, Hilary, and John.
Hi guys, I'm Erica Hansen. I'm the land protection specialist and staff biologist at the Jackson Hole Land Trust. I think I'd have to go with cedar waxwing. They've got a really soft spot in my heart. That was my spark bird that really got me interested in birding. I got my first pair of binoculars and was looking at some birds that I thought were going to look kind of brown and boring and some bushes in my front yard in Utah. And I had a cedar waxwing in my binoculars and I saw all the beautiful colors on it. And that did it for me. And I was hooked on birding from there after that. So they'd have to be my favorite.
Okay, I'll go ahead. I'm Hilary Turner. I'm the program coordinator for the Jackson Hole Wildlife Foundation. And my favorite regional bird is whatever bird I'm looking at that time. But for real, probably a tie between golden eagle, American dipper, and common raven.
So I'm John Stephenson. I'm a wildlife biologist at Grand Teton National Park. And I thought this one was easy too. Peregrine falcon came right to me. That's one of these, birds nesting up in the canyons and the Tetons especially. So I like the mountainous habitat and, impressive flyers. And then this morning, I was all ready to say peregrine falcon, but we did our first sage-grouse surveys this morning. And I'm quite partial to them as well. So honorable mention, to see them strutting is quite the scene. And then I happened to get involved with a goshawk operation today too. So I saw 2 goshawks and I remembered that they should get some honorable mention as well. So I got 3.
Clearly, it's hard to pick just one, and certainly understand that. If any of the audience members here today have questions, feel free to put them in the Zoom chat, and we'll try to get to them if we can. But to start out, this is titled Winged Migration. So I'm going to ask Erica to define what is migration. Is it defined by birds moving a certain distance, depending on the season, or could you dive into that a little deeper?
Sure. I'm going to keep my answer to this one pretty short and sweet because I think we're going to dive into all the really fascinating nuances of this in the next couple of questions. But really, a migration is just a periodic movement, a seasonal movement by birds. And so, as diverse as birds are, migrations are equally as diverse. So migrations can be short distance, they can be medium distance, they can be really long distance between hemispheres, and they can vary in elevation too. So birds might migrate, a short distance, but a dramatic change in elevation. So all of those things will allow birds to access different habitats that they need seasonally throughout the year. And I'll let some of our panelists get into some of the details of that in the next couple of questions.
Thank you, Erica. Yeah, so Hilary, for you, I'd like to ask, why do birds migrate? What might trigger a bird to migrate, if you can boil that down?
Yeah, so that is the million-dollar question, and it's a huge question with a huge answer about life history strategies and evolutionary trade-offs and all these kind of things. But I guess what it really boils down to is resources. So birds are dependent on resources. And when we think about birds in northern latitudes, they have definitely access to more resources seasonally. So we think of like abundant food and longer day lengths and things like that that occur during the summer months. But then once those conditions start to deteriorate into the fall, the landscape no longer has the ability to hold as many birds resource-wise. So those birds will start to move south. And I would also say that what triggers migration is another huge question with a huge answer. And there are many aspects of what can trigger bird migration, but it is genetic. It is also outside of the bird. So things like day length, photo period, when those days do become shorter, it triggers hormonal changes inside the birds that make them start to have migratory restlessness is actually what it's called. And we've observed this over centuries actually with people's caged birds, regardless of what's going on, the bird is in the cage. And as the day length starts to shrink, we see these birds starting to try to move, even though they're inside a cage confined inside someone's home. So it is dependent on internal, external forces. But then in terms of shorter distance migrations, things like food resources, like we talked about earlier, and severe weather conditions can also trigger migration. So it is a lot of things. And that was a probably terrible answer if you're a scientist, but that's my answer.
Yeah, any of the other panelists, if you want to jump in, please feel free to do so. Otherwise, I would ask you, Hilary, and the other panelists as well, what are some migratory birds that we might recognize around Northwest Wyoming?
So in terms of migratory birds in Northwestern Wyoming, I would say it's almost easier to try to think of a bird that's not migratory in Western Wyoming. So things like black-capped chickadees or common ravens, we're all familiar with seeing them throughout the year, but those are really the only two examples I could come up with right off the bat that are non-migratory. So, and as Erica mentioned, there's short, medium, and long distance migrants. So, and a great example of a migratory bird in Northwestern Wyoming that has a kind of interesting migration pattern is the American dipper. So they do breed in streams at high elevations. And then as winter starts to come and those streams that hold their food and they're highly dependent on start to freeze over, the birds will move down in elevation, eventually arriving, as far as the stream freezes to the valley floors in the wintertime. So I think that's a really fascinating example. And then even things like American robins, the American robins are present here during the breeding season, often do move out, and the birds that we might encounter in the non-breeding season are birds that have come out of the Arctic, and it's often dependent on things like their, again, food resources. So if there's a really good berry crop in a valley, then the birds might stop right there. But if the berry crop is non-existent like it was this winter, the birds might skip over that valley completely. So it is just dependent on so many things, but most of the birds in Northwestern Wyoming, I would say, are migratory to some extent.
I think to add on to that, one thing that I forget quite a bit, because I took German in high school as opposed to Spanish, is a lot of these birds actually spend a minority of their time up here. And I tend to think about that as, my warbler or my curlew, like our Wyoming bird. But while we're talking a lot about people's backyards and properties today, that a huge portion of these species life history occurs across an international boundary quite often. And then there are very few species, like some of the alpine songbirds, I know I've said it many times, with black rosy finches, they're one of the few species that actually has a little bit of a migration, but the entire species actually stays in the lower 48 itself.
Yeah, I think another good example. So I was just thinking about, these different types of migrations, but you have, so sage grouse, we have, they're year-round residents, but they are reliant on sagebrush, like exposed sagebrush year-round. And so they're breeding basically throughout the park, throughout the Jackson Hole Valley, and nesting, and there's leks that are dispersed throughout the whole valley. And then in winter, they still need access to the sagebrush, so they're still held to the Jackson Hole area. But you may see these sort of these migrations, sometimes a little bit north to south, but they're not leaving the valley. They may go from Spread Creek if they're nesting up there, down south to the Kelly hayfields area. And so you see that's kind of maybe doesn't fit into any of these boxes super well. So a year-round resident that kind of migrates locally.
I'd add another one of my favorite birds that was a close contender for my favorite bird tonight is the rough-legged hawk. And they migrate from up near the Arctic Circle, and they migrate south for the winter, as many birds do, except Wyoming is the area that they migrate to for the winter. So balmy Wyoming is where they go to for the winter months. And I just think that it's so incredible that they, come down here for the harshness of the Wyoming winter, and that is their, place that they would overwinter before they return to their breeding habitat. So birds are just so diverse, and their, migration strategies are equally diverse.
Yeah, that idea, I think we mentioned just sort of a reverse migration, like seasonally, we think of all these birds leaving for the winter, and then that's one of the examples of a bird that would come here for the winter. And another one I thought of was the trumpeter swan. So we have them year round. Of course, they nest here, but not in very high numbers. And so you have a lot of birds. You might see larger groups of trumpeter swans in the wintertime. And so that's another species coming, migrating from that summer that nests, breed up in, say, Canada, for example, and they're coming down here and choosing to winter in some of the open waters down in Jackson Hole. Those are kind of the two I could think of. I'm not sure. Yeah, obviously Carl and Hilary, if you guys don't know them, yeah, they're definitely experts in all things birds. Do you guys have any other examples of?
East-west, so a lot of, like, say, loons, and they have a quite a variety of migratory paths. Where short in New England, they basically roll over a service road into the ocean from their freshwater breeding site, and they're back at their wintering grounds, versus Wyoming, where they, we've had one individual that's been documented to go down to the Baja Peninsula. But some species, such as the harlequin duck, the male might fly, say, in Wyoming. They're a very brightly colored duck that doesn't look like anything else that you might see, and they are in often kind of faster moving cricks. I won't go into the details on that, but they, they do have more of an east-west migration depending on which coast they're on, and that the male only sticks around for about a month to copulate with the female until she's on nest, and probably is expending a lot of energy during that period, but then leaves for the rest of the year and is only out for a couple months at best.
Yeah, and I would add, and when I saw this question, I thought Zach asked it because he loves game birds. And I was thinking of the dusky grouse. So a dusky grouse is a bird that will actually move up in elevation. So that's a kind of interesting thing. We don't think of birds as selecting more severe climates in the wintertime, but the dusky grouse does go up often in terms of elevation in the wintertime, and persists at those higher elevations on like pine needles and stuff like that. So.
Yeah, I thought that was fascinating when I heard that, they're physiologically adapting to living out a harsh winter in Wyoming, and just think that's fascinating. Looks like we got a question in the chat from Bernie for John. Are the trumpeter swans we see in the winter the local breeders or migrants from Canada, or both?
That's a good question. So, and I maybe would look to Carl after this, but so we certainly have, so our population that summers here is relatively small. So we have, only a handful of nests really that territories in the park. In any given year, we may have one or two that are occupied, and then you start going outside a little bit, you have a few more. But our summer population here is pretty small. The Upper Green has been, through lots of conservation efforts, is recovering and has a lot, another population there that's a breeding population. And so it's pretty small, and then our population increases in the winter. So you have more of these birds, certainly birds that are migrating down from Canada and maybe even Alaska, further north. Carl, do you maybe have anything to add on, where do our local birds go?
Yeah, I think that, no, that's a good question, especially stressing the fact that I think that there's also often this misconception about how are swans doing in the local Jackson area, where there's a ton of them in the winter, but we actually, like John keeps on stressing, we have very few breeding birds in our immediate surrounding, unless you're to go to the Upper Green. I think that there's some speculation about birds here, maybe going down as far south as Utah. But GPS and GSM collars have recently been put out on some individuals, and we're just starting to tease out what an annual migration route might look like. What do they do after 2 years? It might even get more confusing. You know, maybe they go somewhere else, and kind of like with mule deer, just probably end up with more questions than answers. But I think also with some of the Jackson birds that there's also there's a double-edged sword, and there's an idea, at least I'll put it that way, going around that more open water in spring weather, folks are running their aerators maybe a little bit too early and opening up open water for birds. And often it seems like it's a good thing to do, but sometimes that can, you know, potentially allow overwintering birds to eat the resources that are under the ice that a resident breeding bird might use later in the season.
There's some county regs on that too.
The what?
There's some county regulations on running your aerators.
Definitely are. Yeah. Largely says don't do it. So
Following up on that question, Carl, when those trumpeter swans migrate, do they use a flyway, or could you explain what a flyway is?
yeah, so maybe I'll stick with more of the greater or the Intermountain West trumpeter swans, you know, anything south of the Canadian border, where they're called we'll just call them GPS collars, you know, or they talk to a satellite. I think often folks will say a radio collar, but it's a collar that will communicate at a regular period about what the swan is doing at a certain interval. And some collars have been put out in places such as the Blackfoot Valley in Montana. And, you know, some of the migration routes only will take them down to, say, the Ruby Valley in Montana. Pretty short migrations compared to what the Canadian birds are doing. But we also have to think about how trumpeter swans were near extirpated in the lower 48, and that only remnant populations that were brought back through a huge multitude of restoration efforts. So a lot of these birds might have lost migration patterns that we aren't aware of, and I think hotly debated right now. But maybe to the flyway, where they're, you know, more well-defined key flyways. So often we hear about the Central or the Pacific Flyway, where we think a lot more about water birds or duck hunters, you know, obsess over them and what patterns are for the year, the kind of central avenues. And, you know, often folks will hear about them in the news, especially recently with avian influenza making its way across the continent, where it is in the Central Flyway right now. It's been detected in Wyoming and Utah and Colorado and many of other places that folks haven't looked, but a little off topic, but.
Hey, we welcome off topic. Looks like we got a question here from Brad and Kristen in the Zoom chat. Can someone please explain to the basinal duck migration through this area? I know that ducks migrate through here, but there are also ducks here all through winter. Why? Anyone got with that?
I guess, again, it would come down to what resources are available for those ducks. So ducks are dependent on open water frequently, or exposed soil, so they can forage for like seeds and stuff if they don't have access to water. So the number of ducks present in the Jackson Hole area or other similar areas would be dependent on the amount of open water. So certainly there are way fewer ducks, even though they do persist here through the winter. But definitely experiencing waterfowl migration right now, and a lot more diversity is coming through, and a lot more numbers are coming through right now. So right now is the time, if you want to go look for ducks, find that big body of water, that open field with exposed soil.
Maybe to add on to the open water part, where a lot of areas are, think of like Flathead Lake and Lake McDonald, and a lot of the reservoirs in Wyoming where historically they've been freezing solid during the winter, and we are seeing more and more overwintering birds in locations where they historically weren't present. Harlequin duck also even come to mind. I think often some of these rarities might get cleaned up by hunters, but it is things are shifting pretty quickly. Oh, Hilary,
We got another question from Brad. Please feel free to ask as many questions as you'd like. My list does not go that much longer, so these are helpful. Can someone speak a little about the migration of our wonderful sandhill cranes and why they stay on the other side of Teton Pass?
I don't know the answer to that question, but I will say it has been phenomenal. The last couple weeks, I've been seeing hundreds in the valleys. I live in Victor, so I bird on this side of the pass, and there are many, many sandhill cranes coming through right now. And I would assume it has something to do with the amount of habitat or the type of habitat, but I don't know the answer to that question.
Yeah, I know that, and this may only be part of the answer, but I know that proximity to grain fields is a contributing factor to where sandhill cranes end up. And so, in the Jackson area, we don't have as much agriculture that produces grain, whereas, over in Teton Valley on the west side of the Tetons, those grain fields and agricultural fields are more abundant as well. And so things like that can also be actually really important habitat sources for sandhill cranes.
I remember asking Bert this question once, and his reply was that most of the sandhills that historically, at least during settlement era, came into Jackson Hole were spillovers from the many, many thousands that used to come through and breed over in Teton Valley and eastern Idaho. And that a lot of the recent agricultural practices in eastern Idaho have been conversion to cattle and not so much grain or hay. And that's also had an impact on actually milk cows, not actually beef cattle. And that's had an impact on the sandhill crane population in eastern Idaho, of which the Jackson Hole population is kind of an adjunct.
Thanks for that, Bernie. This is kind of a tough question that I'd float to all the panelists here, and Bernie, feel free to chime in as well. What is a regionally significant threat to migratory birds, especially as we're seeing avian bird flu right now?
Energy development, probably in every form, is always a tough one of balancing where we get things and also what the impact on the environment is. There's no lack of hand-wringing over, green energy that is very good probably for carbon emissions, but where wind towers are is directly where a lot of these birds are migrating through. And the TWS, the Wildlife Society meeting recently, I think, saw a figure of something, an estimated 700 million birds are killed a year with strikes. And I think there's enough examples to go around of threats to migration.
In terms of regionally significant, I would also say Jackson Hole itself is a hub for recreation, and oftentimes recreation can have impacts on bird species like common loons or trumpeter swans that are really sensitive around their nests. And when we have, people using trails that are adjacent to lakes where loons are nesting or swans are having their young, those types of recreation activities can have pretty significant impacts at the population level. So Carl and John could probably talk a lot more about this than me.
Yeah, I mean, it's a good question. Just the regional threats. I mean, if you're thinking about, you talked about avian flu, and, you talk about energy development on a larger scale. And certainly, so with my position, I'm just dealing with, obviously we collaborate and are involved with a lot of projects that are more in the GYE, but for my position, just looking at populations, even just within the park. And I think, yeah, Hilary, you hit on two of the key ones. So trumpeter swans, loons, just with the increased recreation, all along. So the way that we mitigate for that is just, we're looking at setting up closures. So especially for those sensitive species, those are two good examples. The other species I can think of, even looking at peregrine falcon. So there's a nest. It's been a territory for years, and it's a very popular climbing route. So we've closed that every year. We try to get in there early just to make sure that site is occupied, and then we close that site because peregrines can also be sensitive to that human disturbance and recreation. And then the last one I was thinking about was just bald eagle. So we do have probably about 12 to 15 territories that could be occupied within the park, and some are on Jackson Lake and some are along the Snake River. And so we have all the increased fishing, boat traffic on the Snake River. We do set up closures, half-mile closures. We're still allowing traffic to go through, but we set up no stopping zones along each occupied eagle nest. And there's one other spot on Jackson Lake where there's a campsite, and there's a nest that's actually right within a couple hundred yards probably. So we end up doing closures as well. So just, yeah, back to your point, Hilary, of just the increased recreation, that disturbance on these nesting birds. So that's kind of what we do to help mitigate that, and for these, especially for these breeding birds and around the nest sites.
I would
Yeah,
also suggest that the Western regional drought has a huge impact on migratory species.
Yeah, somebody, and maybe it's good, I mean, with this panel here too, someone asked me the question. I was briefing a couple of people yesterday on the sage grouse situation here. And so that's one where we have this isolated small population in Jackson Hole. And so there's concerns that most of the research has identified just winter habitat as a limiting factor. So you have these really big winters that you just have you don't have enough exposed sagebrush. The birds end up being more vulnerable, moving around to spots that they haven't been before, and just more susceptible to predation. And so someone asked that question. They said, well, what do you think with warming, with climate change and warming conditions, could that help this? So there's some species like climate change overall, and you talked, Bernie, about drought. I think we look at that as a negative for most species. And anyway, so they raised that question. Could that help sage grouse, for example? And my first response was probably no, but maybe start thinking about it. Could that have any benefit to sage grouse, given that the winter habitat is limiting? But I think you start thinking with warming temperatures, you also probably have increased fire risk, which then can burn some of this, higher, more decadent sagebrush. And then you also have the increased risk of weeds and cheatgrass spreading. So it seems like it's probably varied and maybe a complex answer, but ultimately I settled on no. But climate change, maybe, is there any other thoughts on that, or species that might benefit or be harmed more than others?
I think a lot of the species of concern are that have been formally ranked or top of our head, kind of like a polar bear. Outlook's probably not very good, are going to be negatively impacted. A lot of the generalists and so are more common species might benefit from a different landscape or one that's becoming a little more homogeneous in some ways. But overall, I think biodiversity, population numbers, there will always be some winners, but it's a really, really bad outlook as far as climate change's impact on not just migratory birds, but probably all species in general. I think to add on to maybe another species when it comes to recreation, and it's always, we talk about loons. It's a hard balance of trying to educate the public, but also not create enough interest that folks want to go find them. It's about the worst thing you can do is to go look for a pair of breeding loons. And if you see them on a lake, you probably should consider leaving at a lot of these locations. They're just that sensitive. And then a misperception or misconception about Maine loons tolerating motorboats and Midwestern loons at the dock at the summer camp, and here several hundred yards away on a trail, they'll bump off a nest, and then a single event can cause a failure. But Harlequin duck's the other one that I think about as well, where places like Glacier National Park have and Grand Teton also has taken efforts, being the most southern, larger part of the population, or within that, the southern end of the population's extent, where kayaking or rafting have a negative impact. In fact, with kayaks and smaller creeks, you kind of think, well, the duck can go wherever it wants, it'll just fly off, and with the harlequin, often it's like chasing a rabbit down a road. They just don't leave it, or a moose down a trail with a snow machine. And so it can have a pretty large impact by just a few number of recreationists.
And I think, thinking about human impacts too, one, as this area continues to be visited by more and more people are moving here, we all are aware of habitat loss as a potential issue, but also habitat degradation. So many species of birds are pretty specific in the types of habitats that they use. You might, like a fox sparrow is going to be really low down and, down in leaves, and lower down in brush and stuff like that. Whereas you would expect to see a, yellow warbler out in the willows. And as you're changing those even micro habitats, that can have a big impact on birds too. So, with people, even just like landscaping and cleaning things up more, even if an area isn't totally developed, if you're changing the structure of the vegetation that's there, or maybe, removing dead woody debris, for example, or things like that, those can have a big impact on birds as well, even though it seems like a really small thing at the time. So I think even those small cumulative impacts can really make a big difference for birds in our area.
So how are they doing right now? Bev asks, how are Teton harlequins and loons doing, and Yellowstone swans? What's the pulse?
Well, and so Carl's probably best to actually answer this question. I'll start maybe just with Teton harlequins and then loons. There's not a whole lot to add, but yeah, Carl has a lot of information about, we just had our loon working group meeting, and Carl is, he's the expert here. But with Teton harlequins, we do monitor them. There have been some studies recently, collaborative work, looking at migration. So putting some transmitters on, looking where their winter ranges are. And then we have been conducting brood surveys for the last several summers. And so the population is mostly limited to the north end of the park at this point. There are some historic sites that were farther south, but at this point, what we know, there are several broods that we find every year up in that north end of the park. And we are doing more work. Actually, Carl's involved in that as well, using some kind of cooler, relatively newer technology to see if we can detect more signs of harlequins in Teton as well as Yellowstone. And again, Carl can speak more on that. Loons, they're doing, sorry, I keep saying that, but Carl, yeah. In Grand Teton, they're okay. I mean, we keep looking for them. We have big efforts every year. There are a few historic sites and territories where they've been. These last several years, we have not had breeding loons in the park. We have detected some presence up on Jackson Lake, but the sort of historic sites have not been occupied. So maybe I'll hand that to Carl. He could probably talk for the next 3 hours on this subject, but maybe a little bit more from Carl on that though.
Don't tempt me. But,
Yeah.
No, I think John covered it, to say the least, where Grand Teton might have experienced a loss in occupancy in some of the southern canyons. Maybe some anecdotal thoughts, because they are so sensitive to human disturbance, that could be part of it, but it's definitely more in the question phase. So more surveys are slated to look at some of these historic sites. So maybe ask that question again in a year or two and have some better answers. But once again, the reason the reason harlequin and swans and loons keep on coming up is that they are some of the highest ranked species of greatest conservation need, as officially designated by the Wyoming Game and Fish Department. Common loons only have, think we documented 26 pairs collectively in the state of Wyoming as of last year. When I say Wyoming, that happens to be the entire GYE population. The next population is over 200 miles away in Montana. They don't go more than about 10 miles from where they hatch. And then genetic neighbors are in Saskatchewan, about 500 to 600 miles away. So the recovery for those guys doesn't see any immigration or immigration. And so it makes it a delicate procedure. I think that what we really do know is that loons have been lost at some of the periphery sites in the core kind of Yellowstone and surrounding areas if we were to ignore the winds for now. And that probably is the biggest concern, where some of them, the lakes are drying up. And not just because the beaver happens to be gone in one location or another, but less precipitation. And that also is impacting the swans, you could say, at large. And, and future projections aren't great. But loons, the biggest threat to nesting sites is probably human disturbance by what folks have been able to determine. And then maybe one of the biggest sources of mortality, and I have to be really stressed that folks who are trying to restore a native fish population, is gill net bycatch, where fisheries crews are really working really hard to maintain the survival of a species, and it has an impact with subsequent bycatch, and they're working really hard to reduce that. Just a lot is happening with the landscape at once, and who knows, the loons probably would do better with the native fisheries in Yellowstone Lake. So none of it's malicious, but yeah, none of them are doing great. But I think that with waterbirds, the optimistic part is that with certain management actions, that there's a potential, at least in the short term, to see recovery. Long-term climate change projections are exactly what you think they are, but as opposed to some species where if a huge portion of the forest burns down, you're out of luck. There could be a silver lining to some of these in the short term.
Thank you. Yeah, I know you could go on for a little while longer about that. Rita's asking, what are the trumpeter swans doing right now? What part of the migration stage are they in? And also, what is the largest regional species of migrating bird in terms of weight? And I'll just say really quick, beginning of April, there was 4 trumpeter swans at our park. And it was really fun to see them out there. So you can catch them out there every now and then, keep your distance and let them feel safe.
I think swans at large, it's an interesting one. If you took all the swans in the lower 48, you put them into one pile, they look like they're growing. And that, and there are some real success stories. Montana's doing really well in the Blackfoot Valley and the Flathead, the really, populations that are taking off. Other places such as Yellowstone, we've been down to 1 breeding pair at a point, which is kind of ironic because Red Rock National Wildlife Refuge, right over by you, Rita, of course, that was kind of the last stronghold for them. And they had a winter feeding program. Folks are just trying to scramble to do anything to keep the population alive. Places like the Upper Green, it's, John spoke about how swans started to see recovery. And right now, I think it's kind of a critical period where we don't know if they're flattening out. Is there some growth, or are we losing some of those sites again? In 5 or 10 years, we'll probably know the trend, of course. But some of the regional occurrences are really tricky, especially with some of it could be recreation, or some of these little tiny ponds are just drying up. Just aren't getting the snowpack anymore to fill them. And I mean, that's anecdotal, but different areas have different metrics. Overall, though, there does seem to be momentum for growth and for their overall lower 48 population. Canada and Alaska, they're doing pretty well for the time being.
And are there any harlequin ducks on the west slope of the Tetons?
There are, yep. The caribou target does have some, and I think I forgot. Right now, some swans, at least I know, at least within the captive breeding programs, are probably on nest right now. But the wild swans are a little further out, and some swans are probably standing on iced over lakes in Yellowstone, waiting for them. to not be hard water. But yeah, harlequin on the west side of the Tetons. The problem is with a lot of these species, we just don't have a whole lot of data to say what did it used to look like. It reminds me of reading an article on Anna's hummingbirds. They're talking about how they're more abundant in Idaho these days. A lot of it's just anecdotal, and it might be true. They could be expanding with ornamental shrubs and humans modifying the landscape, but because we just have really poor records, it's hard to say in a concrete way that yes, they're expanding or this is happening or that.
All right, I'm going to steer back to script here for a minute. How does protected land in our area help migratory birds? Erica and John, if y'all could speak to that, that would be great.
You want to go? I mean,
Sure.
yeah, and I can, you want to go ahead? Go ahead.
Yeah, I can start, and
Great.
I'll speak more specifically to private lands. But in Wyoming, really, estimates vary, but about 1.2% of Wyoming is riparian habitat. And riparian habitat is incredibly important for migratory birds. That's where our water resources are. That's where all the green vegetation is growing. There's lots of good cover there. And a disproportionate amount of Wyoming's riparian habitats are private lands because of the way European settlement of the West happened and the way our ownership structure is currently laid out across the state of Wyoming. So really a lot of really important migratory bird habitat exists on private lands and riparian corridors. And that means that migratory birds, when they arrive here and they're looking for nesting habitat, especially neotropical migrants, are really depending on that riparian habitat to be intact. And because there's such a patchwork of ownership in those riparian lands, it's really important for every landowner in those areas to maintain the quality of habitat that birds need to reproduce when they get here. And there have been studies. There was a study in the early 2000s done in the Snake River corridor that showed a direct relationship between increasing residential development along the riparian corridor and decreasing avian diversity. So it was really interesting because the abundance of birds was staying about the same, but the diversity was going down. So we're losing, as development goes up, we're losing more species of neotropical migrant birds, and they're getting replaced by generalists like starlings and grackles and magpies and things like that we're all really familiar with seeing around the area. So maintaining that habitat quality is really important. And so with the land trust, we work with private landowners to place properties under conservation easement, which helps protect those habitats and ensure that they're going to be in place for migratory birds when they return here year after year after year. And, even on unprotected lands, placing development outside of sensitive habitats, outside of those dense willow shrublands, outside of, cottonwood galleries or towards the edges can actually really help birds because it gives them those core areas where they can, reproduce undisturbed throughout the summer. So what's happening on private lands here is really important, not just for, birds that we see all the time, but how they connect to everywhere else they migrate across the globe. So what we do here has a really big impact on what is happening everywhere else in the world.
Yeah, I should have gone first. It's hard to follow that. And I think that's just really pertinent and just a super answer. And I think, we're just kind of dealing with different scales, maybe in perspective. So with my position and just looking at, Grand Teton National Park, it is this larger scale. And we're looking at, big chunk of land, large scale with a mission to, we're guided by that mission to preserve and protect resources. And so I think we're just really fortunate here in the park, that it's such a large tract of land. Yes, we see increased visitation. Sometimes it seems like there's some increased even development, but I think it's, for the most part, we are very much protected. And maybe that's the lesson too. It's just a different scale, but that's maybe the philosophy, our mission to preserve and protect can probably go beyond, the Park Service. Whenever we have any sort of issues, it's, we are also guided by the Migratory Bird Treaty Act, which we all are as well. And so anytime we are doing any sort of actions, we are making sure that we're doing bird surveys, making sure that our actions in the park are not disturbing or harming any nesting birds. So yeah, maybe there are some lessons too there that could also kind of go beyond on different scales.
Go. Stop it. No.
Thanks for that. Hilary, I'm going to direct this one at you, but the other panelists are welcome to chime in as well. What can our community do to help our birds?
Well, Zach, thanks so much for allowing me to step up on my soapbox here and tell you all what you can do in your daily lives. It does come down to decision making. So in 2015, Scott Lost and co-authors quantified direct anthropogenic mortality on birds. So that means what human influences are actually killing birds. And the top three things there are cats, windows, and cars. So you can keep your cats indoors, and we can also work to remove feral cats from the landscape. That's probably the number one thing that you could do in your daily life to positively impact migratory birds. And then of course, fixing your windows. So putting the sticker of a hawk on your window, it does not actually do anything. But there are things that you can do to make your windows a little bit safer for birds. So birds don't perceive that they can fly through the window. They perceive their habitat reflected in that window. So anything that breaks up that reflection of that window is something that's really going to help birds. And then of course, turning your lights off at night in office buildings and in residential properties. That light can attract birds to windows so they can fly around disoriented, exhausting themselves and eventually dying and also colliding with windows. So cats, windows, and then cars. Cars are a hard one. We do kind of just accept that roadkill is a byproduct of our transportation system, which is really unfortunate, but driving slower and driving less, carpooling, when you have to commute over the pass, these kind of things, just driving less essentially can really help. And then I did want to briefly speak about the conundrums of feeding birds. So bird feeders, yeah, I will admit, I love watching bird feeders. I love, having the birds in my yard is a really great thing. It can cause a lot of joy in my home and things like that. But it does cause unnatural concentrations of birds in urban areas, which increases the risk of disease transmission. It increases the risk of striking a window because they're closer to houses. It increases their risk of getting eaten by a cat because we're drawing them into these urban areas. And then of course, natural predation, sharp-shinned hawks and merlins key in on these areas. So the conundrum of bird feeding is, is a big one. You can decide for yourself whether or not you want to continue doing that activity. But the other thing about bird feeding that I always try to remember is we have to produce that food somehow that we're feeding the birds. So you're also contributing to large scale conversion of habitat to grow things like sunflower seeds when you are economically supporting such a thing as bird feeding. I want to give the other panelists a chance to chime in, but I did also want to talk about being ethical with your photography. So never flushing birds, especially in the wintertime, not lingering nearing nesting birds. So that's just a thing we should never be doing. Not using any playback or other lures to get those like high quality photographs. Those are really important things. And then habitat loss and conversion can have massive impacts to birds. This is aside from the direct anthropogenic mortality that we were talking about. So respecting those seasonal closures like John and Carl talked about, supporting land trusts and other organizations that are seeking to protect that habitat, and planting native vegetation and avoiding monocultures such as lawns in your backyard can have really positive implications for birds. So I know that Teton Conservation District is right now doing a wildflower sale. So planting those native shrubs and forbs in your yards can really have a positive impact in terms of, pollinators all the way up to avian species. So I would say that. And then the final thing, I know this is a lot, but the final thing, as Carl mentioned earlier, is that a lot of these birds are spending, 60 to 70% of their time in the neotropics. So another thing you can do is to buy bird-friendly coffee, which is going to be a certification that means that that coffee was grown under a shade canopy of the native tropical environment, rather than having that tropical forest cut down to produce your coffee. So there are a variety of certifications. You can see fair trade, organic, all these, but none of those certifications mean that it was actually grown in a shade forest. So you want to look for that bird-friendly certification. Okay, and I'll stop talking so I give the other panelists a chance.
I can tie into that really quickly. I'm seeing a question in the chat that's just about private yards and how cleaning up your yard might not be helpful to birds. And I think I alluded to this earlier. And so just to clarify on sort of what I was getting at was exactly what Hilary just mentioned about converting diverse habitat into, you know, only a lawn monoculture. So maintaining that habitat diversity is really important. And that can look like a lot of different things depending on what habitat you have in your yard, but just trying to be mindful that maintaining that habitat diversity can be really helpful to support, you know, a broad diversity of birds instead of single species.
Touch on bird feeders again. That often when folks ask, well, what can we do about alpine songbirds and climate change? Not really something you can do at home by just turning off the light, you know, immediately. But what's something really practical? All those things Hilary's talking about. You know, I think, you know, often in the news it will say, please put your bird feeders away when there are new and emerging diseases. A lot of them, you know, say avian influenza is going around right now. If we keep talking about that, I'll threaten to bring my girlfriend as a state vet out from behind the other wall here and talk to you about it. But yeah, I really think that just minding that, you know, an individual can have an impact, that if you're the last one in the neighborhood who still has a bird feeder up and every single finch, you know, around is feeding in a really concentrated area, that could have a real world consequence, even if you don't see it. You know, most birds that die or strike things are removed off the landscape almost immediately, so we don't often see the consequences, but that does make a difference.
Yeah, and just briefly about the kind of messy yard concept that Jody was asking about. I would say, yes, it is better to leave the leaf litter alone on the ground. You know, raking up your leaves removes insect habitat and everything on up from that. So having a messy garden or a messy yard is not necessarily a bad thing, and it actually can increase the diversity of birds that start coming to your yard in terms of just, you know, leaving things as they naturally would be. So great question, Jody.
In the interest of time, I just want to jump in and say thank you so much, Carl, Hilary, Erica, and John, for being here. I've learned so much and just really appreciate your time. And thank you to everyone who attended today's happy hour. I think we probably have time for a question or two, but I just wanted to thank everyone before y'all start trickling off here. So why don't we scroll back up here? Lori Bay asks, a few years ago, we had only 18 breeding pairs, and that included the winds. Are there still pairs there of loons?
Yeah, so loons, despite being most threatened species in the state of Wyoming and the smallest breeding population, I'm forgetting the right language here, but they're also one of the most understudied as far as where they've historically been. Loons, there's anecdotal sightings. There's probably folks who are here right now that might have seen them in the 70s or 80s, and they are still breeding in the winds. There's just a total lack of understanding of what their occupancy happens to be, and we don't think it's necessarily a really population dense region, but we could be proven wrong, and with more effort, maybe we'll have a better answer for that in the future.
Thank you. And then let's see, Bev asks, would more beavers help our birds? That's probably a very multifaceted answer.
some species such as trumpeter swan are almost exclusively breeding behind beaver dams and breeding on beaver lodges. A lot of the scenes that you see in Canada of breeding water birds, yeah, tremendous resource. And I think the fact that we're way behind what the historic norm for beaver occupancy on the landscape would really suggest that we don't have too many of them compared to the historic norm. And if, 100 years ago is kind of the benchmark of what we consider to be healthy, then, where appropriate, more beaver on the landscape would certainly benefit by impounding more water and creating that really rare but essential habitat type.
Thank you. Okay, final question here. I'm just going to ask for maybe a sentence from each of you about what is the most rewarding or interesting part of your work with birds. And sorry that you have to boil it down to a sentence, but that's all we have time for.
Yeah, for me, it's just working on all these conservation projects with experts like, so Carl has done so much for loons in particular, harlequins, and just working with, getting exposure to all these experts, the work with Hilary as well, just to see someone like her in the field is, it's really a gift and a treat to just collaborate and coordinate on all these projects and meet all these people, but also ultimately for the, conservation of all these birds.
I can go next. I would say that the most rewarding part for me is just the reminder that what we do here impacts like everywhere else in the world. I just think that that's so amazing, and that a bird I see here might be down in Argentina, or it might be in Mexico, or it might be above the Arctic Circle. Like, and I just think that it's so special that we can interact with these amazing animals that go so many other places in the globe.
I would say that for me, it's selfish. I love birds. They've brought so much joy to my life. They've changed my life in so many ways. And so just seeing and understanding the intrinsic value of those organisms on the landscape is what I really love about doing work with birds.
Carl, you're up.
Probably got into this field to get away from people and go into the woods. And that's saying the flip side is that usually running into folks on the side of the road or in the city and being able to communicate what we're learning, and the educational portion is really rewarding, even though people who know me, I gripe about being stuck in the city or something like that sometimes. So, but that interaction is really good.
Well, thanks everyone for coming. I'm so grateful for your time. I want to ask the final question that's there, just because we're so close to being complete. What about only feeding birds that are in migration?
Well, I saw that question and I would have the same answer to feeding birds any time of the year. You have the same problems, the same concepts are applicable. I don't think that birds need bird feeders or humans to do what they've been doing for millennia before there were white Europeans on the landscape. So I would say, it's up to you, but they don't need it. Short answer.
Thanks so much. If you guys have any questions, concerns, reach out. I can connect you guys with the panelists, and hope to see you around Jackson.
Thank you so much, everyone.
Bye, howdy.
Thank you, everybody.
Thanks so much. Have a great night.
Thanks, y'all.
Thank you.